It was both the most humiliating day of my life and the day that ultimately reshaped it forever. My name is Jeremy Morgan. I'm 36 years old, founder and CEO of a real estate and investment conglomerate with a network that stretches across the United States. To many, I'm a symbol of success, a bold entrepreneur, a leader who built something out of nothing. But a decade ago, I was just a 27-year-old living in a shabby apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, working at a financial firm for a salary barely enough to cover rent and a few meals. I had no grand vision, no clear ambition. I was simply trying to keep my head above water, looking for some kind of anchor, a reason to exist. But inside I always felt lost, like everyone else had a place in the world, and I didn't. My family was far from ordinary. My grandfather, Edward Morgan, was a legend. He had risen from nothing to build Morgan Enterprises, a real estate and investment empire worth hundreds of millions. He was stern, distant, and reserved, but his eyes always carried a sharpness, as if they could pierce straight through a person. I grew up under the weight of his towering reputation, hearing endless stories about his brilliance, his decisiveness, and, at times, his ruthless business instincts. But closeness? That was something I never shared with him. Not because I didn't want to, but because he always seemed to keep a deliberate distance from everyone, even me, his only grandson to bear the Morgan name. When he died, the entire family, my parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, gathered at a law office in downtown Chicago. It was the heart of winter, the kind of day where the sky hung low and gray, as if foreshadowing the coldness inside. I still remember walking into that room with its polished wood-paneled walls, the long gleaming table, and dozens of calculating eyes silently measuring each other. Everyone knew my grandfather's will was going to alter their lives. They all expected their share, luxurious homes, company shares, or at least enough cash to live in comfort forever. I sat at the far end of the table, doing my best to disappear. I didn't expect much. I had no real place in that hierarchy. My father, Robert Morgan, Edward's eldest son, was already running Morgan Enterprises and took pride in carrying his father's empire forward. My mother, sharp-tongued and ambitious, never stopped reminding me that I had to prove myself worthy of the Morgan legacy. My aunts, uncles, and cousins all looked ready to collect what they thought was theirs. As for me, all I wanted was to get through it unnoticed, not called out, not compared, not humiliated. But fate has a way of never letting me off easily. The lawyer, Mr. Harold Grayson, an elderly man with a deep voice and gold-rimmed glasses, began to read. The room went silent, broken only by the rustle of pages and heavy, uneven breaths. Names were called one after another, each tied to staggering assets that left me in disbelief. My father received my grandfather's Lake Forest estate along with 40% of the company's shares. My Aunt Ellen was given multiple properties across Florida and California. My cousin James, the one who always considered himself the rightful heir, was handed $2 million in cash and a penthouse in Manhattan. The list went on with numbers and properties beyond anything I'd ever imagined. Then came my name. Every head in the room turned toward me. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. I wasn't expecting anything remarkable, but deep down, I still carried a fragile hope that my grandfather had seen me, that he had believed in me enough to leave some sign of it. Jeremy Morgan, Mr. Grayson read, his voice even, though his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than it had on anyone else. Mr. Edward Morgan leaves you a wooden box containing 5 sealed letters. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. And then, the laughter began. A soft chuckle from Aunt Ellen, followed by a louder burst from James. My father didn't laugh, but the shake of his head said enough, disappointment written across his face. My mother leaned towards someone beside her and whispered, her words sharp and cutting. Other cousins muttered, each comment slicing deeper into me. A wooden box. That's all he gets. Some letters. So much for being the heir. The laughter grew louder, rolling over me like a wave. My face burned, my ears throbbed, my whole body felt on fire. I wanted to rise and shout that I didn't want anything, that I never expected a thing. But I couldn't. I just sat there, fists clenched tight under the table, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Mr. Grayson placed a small, weathered wooden box in front of me. Its surface was smooth, worn down by time. To everyone else, it looked like nothing. To me, in that moment, it felt like everything, and nothing at all. The box was unremarkable. No carvings, no gemstones, just a plain wooden box you might find in an old antique shop for a few dollars. Inside, just as he had said, were 5 neatly stacked letters, each sealed with a faded red wax stamp. I ran my fingers over the rough texture of the paper and felt a strange sensation stir inside me. It wasn't hope. It wasn't disappointment. It was more like a question, an enigma I didn't yet know how to solve. "That's it," James sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Grandfather really knew how to surprise people. Jeremy, maybe you should open a post office with all those letters of yours." The room erupted in laughter again. I said nothing. I just stared at the box, feeling the weight of it pressing down on my chest. After the will reading, I left the lawyer's office without a word. I didn't want to meet my mother's pitying gaze or hear another jeer from James. Clutching the wooden box, I stepped into the freezing Chicago air. The wind sliced through my coat, making me shiver. I felt smaller than ever, as if the world itself were laughing at me. I had allowed myself the faintest hope that my grandfather would leave me something, not money or property, but a sign that he believed in me, that he didn't see me as the useless failure my family seemed to think I was. Back in my apartment, I set the box on the kitchen table and stared at it for hours. I didn't want to open it. Part of me feared the disappointment. Part of me dreaded confronting the reality that this was all I had been left. But curiosity eventually won. I retrieved a letter opener and carefully broke the wax seal on the first envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, the strong, determined handwriting unmistakably my grandfather's. The message was brief but electrifying. "Jeremy, you are the only one I have chosen to carry out this task. Deliver the remaining 5 letters to the addresses I have provided. If you succeed, a portion of the true legacy will be yours. Do not fail me." Below this message was a list of 5 addresses, stretching across Ohio and Illinois. No explanations. No hints. Just a simple, enigmatic command: deliver these letters. I sank into a chair, my mind spinning. What was this? A joke? A test? Or one last jab from my grandfather, even in death? Maybe my family was right. Perhaps I was destined to be nothing more than an unwilling courier, the punchline of his final, elaborate prank. And yet, deep inside, a small voice whispered that these letters were more than paper and ink. They held something greater, something I hadn't yet understood. I didn't know it then, but this was the start of a journey that would change my life forever. These letters were keys to the lessons my grandfather had spent a lifetime mastering. And now, he intended for me to learn them the hard way, personally, fully, and without shortcuts. But first, I had to face humiliation, doubt, and myself. That day, I didn't just receive a wooden box, I received a challenge. And I had no idea that it would mark the beginning of my own empire. I stared at the box on the kitchen table, my heart heavy with uncertainty. A part of me wanted to discard it, and forget everything that had just happened. Another, smaller but more stubborn part whispered that this was no accident. My grandfather, the man with piercing eyes and razor-sharp intellect, never acted without purpose. Perhaps this box held something far greater than I could imagine. I opened the first letter. His handwriting, resolute and unmistakably his, greeted me like an old, commanding voice. "Deliver the first letter to Marco Rossi, 1427 Maple Street, Springfield, Ohio. Complete this task and you will understand." No explanation. No hints. Just a name, an address, and 4 more letters staring back at me with wax seals that seemed to mock my hesitation. My family had been right. I was merely a messenger, an errand boy in my grandfather's final will. Yet I had nothing to lose. My life was dull, my career uninspired. If this was a game, I would play it to the end, if only to prove I wasn't the failure everyone assumed. I took 3 days off work, summoning every ounce of courage. Springfield, Ohio, was a 5-hour drive from Chicago. I placed the wooden box on the passenger seat of my old Honda Civic, its engine groaning as if protesting the journey ahead. I turned on the radio, trying to drown out the chaos in my head, but unease lingered. Who was Marco Rossi? Why him? And why me, a nobody in my family's eyes, for this task? Springfield appeared in the late afternoon under a gray, biting winter sky. The town was quiet, almost picturesque, with cobblestone streets and modest wooden homes. I pulled up in front of 1427 Maple Street, a weathered house with a cluttered front yard of woodworking tools and scattered planks. A wooden sign, Rossi's Woodworks, swayed in the wind. I took a deep breath, gripped the letter, and knocked. The door opened to reveal a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, a weathered face, and sharp, lively eyes. Sawdust clung to his rolled-up flannel sleeves. "Who are you?" His voice carried a faint Italian accent, rough but curious. "I'm Jeremy Morgan," I said, striving to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "I'm here to deliver this letter from my grandfather, Edward Morgan." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition passing through them. Carefully, he took the letter and broke the wax seal. I stood frozen, unsure of what to say, unsure of what I had walked into. Marco Rossi read the letter. His hands trembled slightly. Surprise shifted into something else, emotion, gratitude, perhaps even understanding. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine, and I felt, for the first time, the gravity of what I had been entrusted with. "This letter," Marco said, his voice catching slightly. "Do you know what it says?" I shook my head, curiosity rising. "No. I was only told to deliver it." He nodded and gestured for me to follow him inside. I stepped into a small, cozy workshop filled with the scent of fresh wood and varnish. Marco placed the letter on the table beside a steaming cup of coffee. "Sit down, Jeremy," he said, his tone low but sincere. "I think you should hear the story behind this." Marco began his tale. Over 20 years ago, he had arrived in America as an Italian immigrant carpenter, dreaming of building his own woodworking business. Life, however, had been unforgiving. No one believed in him, no one would hire an unknown immigrant. "I worked odd jobs," he said, voice tinged with bitterness. "Scraping by in a rundown boarding house. People called me useless. They looked at me like I had no future. Then my grandfather had entered his life. Edward Morgan, already a successful businessman, had met Marco by chance in a furniture store. He noticed the tables, chairs, and cabinets Marco had crafted by hand, and he saw something others did not: talent. "He didn't just buy my work," Marco said, eyes lighting up. "He loaned me money, interest-free, to start my workshop. He said, 'Marco, I believe you can do this. Just don't give up.' Thanks to that loan, Marco built his workshop. Rossi's Woodworks was no longer a small, unknown shop. It had grown into a respected brand in Springfield, employing dozens of people." Pointing to the letter in front of me, Marco continued, "Your grandfather forgave that debt long ago. This letter confirms it. And he wrote a message in it: those who love their craft will always find their place, if someone believes in them first." I sat in stunned silence. My grandfather, the man I had always thought cold and distant, had done this. He had seen potential in a stranger, someone the world had dismissed, and had placed his trust in him. A rush of emotions surged through me: admiration, confusion, and even a twinge of jealousy. Why had he never shown that faith in me? "You know, Jeremy," Marco said softly, "your grandfather didn't just give me money. He gave me a chance, something no one else dared to offer. And now, I think he's doing the same for you." I looked at him, unsure what to say. The mocking voices of my family still echoed in my mind, but Marco's sincerity, the warmth in his eyes, made me wonder. Perhaps this was the first lesson my grandfather wanted me to learn: trust, not only in others, but in myself. Before I left, Marco grasped my hand firmly. Thank you for bringing this letter. And Jeremy, don't let anyone make you think you're not worthy. If Edward Morgan chose you for this task, you are not ordinary. I returned to my car, the wooden box resting beside me, my heart heavy yet flickering with a small spark of hope. The first letter had been delivered, and though its meaning was not fully clear, something inside me had begun to shift. This journey was no longer about simply delivering letters. It was about confronting myself and the legacy my grandfather had left behind. As I drove away from Springfield, I glanced at the 4 remaining letters in the box. They remained silent, but I sensed each one held another lesson, another door to open. Doubt lingered, but a small flame had begun to kindle within me. Trust, the kind Marco had received, the kind my grandfather placed in me, was perhaps the first key to unlocking my path. The drive to Wichita, Kansas, for the second letter was long. The flat Kansas plains stretched endlessly under a gray, winter sky. I stopped halfway at a gas station, filling the tank and drinking bitter coffee to stay alert. I stared at the letter in my hand, wondering who Richard Coleman was, a craftsman? A businessman? Another piece of my grandfather's puzzle? I had no answers, but I knew one thing: I had to keep going. Wichita emerged in the early morning as the first rays of sunlight spilled across its wide streets and low-rise buildings. 312 Oak Avenue was a modest but tidy 2-story house, a small sign hanging by the door, Coleman Transport. I parked, checked the letter in my hand, and took a deep breath. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the strange sense that I was about to step into someone else's story, a story that wasn't mine, yet somehow might change me. I knocked on the door. An elderly man, at least 80, opened it. Silver hair framed a weathered face, but his eyes, bright and piercing, had clearly seen a lifetime of triumphs and hardships. He wore a crisp blue shirt, but his gnarled hands and faint scars told me he wasn't a man who had spent his life behind a desk. "What do you need?" His voice was deep, cautious, almost wary. "I'm Jeremy Morgan," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I'm here to deliver this letter from my grandfather, Edward Morgan." The name made the man pause. His eyes narrowed, as if searching for some distant memory. He took the letter from me, his fingers trembling slightly as he broke the wax seal. I stood there awkwardly, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't mine. Coleman read the letter. His expression shifted, from surprise to emotion to a sad, wistful smile. Then he looked at me, eyes softening with warmth, as though he were seeing a long-lost relative. "You're Edward's grandson," he said quietly, but with a warmth that made the words feel heavy with meaning. "Come in, Jeremy. There's something you need to know." I stepped inside. The house was simple, yet cozy, filled with family photographs and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. Coleman gestured for me to sit, placing the letter on the table before he began to speak. His story nearly took my breath away. Over 40 years ago, when my grandfather was a young, ambitious businessman teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, Richard Coleman had been the one to save him. At the time, Richard was a modest investor, not wealthy by any means, but he had an unshakable faith in those who dared to dream. "My grandfather came to my door one rainy night," Richard said, eyes glimmering with memory. "Soaked to the bone, but burning with determination. He said, 'Richard, I just need one chance. I'll repay you tenfold.'" Richard lent him the money, not because he had excess, but because he believed in the man Edward Morgan could become. And he didn't stop there. He offered guidance, shared experience, and bolstered my grandfather's confidence. Thanks to that loan, my grandfather revived his company, eventually building Morgan Enterprises into the empire my family revered. But the most astonishing part: Richard had never told anyone this story. No one knew. He didn't seek recognition or praise. He simply acted on what he knew was right. Richard lifted the letter with reverence. "This," he said, "is a copy of an old contract, long settled. But with it comes a message from your grandfather: no one succeeds alone. Gratitude for those who save you." That is true strength. I sat there stunned. My grandfather hadn't just repaid Richard's loan. Years later, when Richard himself faced ruin, his transportation company went bankrupt, the press labeling him a failure, my grandfather quietly stepped in to help him rebuild. No fanfare. No demand for recognition. He simply did what was right, just as Richard had done for him decades earlier. I thought I had lost everything, Richard continued, voice thick with emotion. But Edward showed up, handed me money, and said, "Richard, now it's my turn. You deserve another chance." Thanks to him, I rebuilt Coleman Transport. Today, my company thrives, and I've never forgotten his kindness. I looked at Richard, a surge of emotions welling inside me. Gratitude, the kind my grandfather and Richard shared, was not mere words, it was action. The way they lifted each other in the darkest moments. And yet, a pang struck my heart. Why had my grandfather never shared this with me? Why had he let me grow up in his shadow, making me feel invisible in his eyes? As if sensing my thoughts, Richard placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Jeremy," he said gently, "your grandfather didn't choose you to deliver these letters by accident. He saw something in you, something you may not see in yourself yet. Don't let doubt cloud your path." I left Richard's house as the sun dipped toward the horizon, clutching the wooden box with the 3 remaining letters. His words lingered in my mind, sparking a quiet flame. Gratitude. Not just saying thanks, but living in a way that honors what someone has given you. My grandfather had taught me this through Richard, and I began to realize that each letter wasn't simply a task, it was a piece of a larger puzzle, a roadmap to the person I could become. As I drove, I glanced at the box. 3 letters remained, waiting for me, and I understood that this journey was far from over. Yet, for the first time, I felt a flicker of certainty in my heart. I wasn't just a messenger. I was Jeremy Morgan. And I was beginning to live up to my grandfather's legacy, one letter at a time. Night had fallen as I drove back from Wichita, the headlights of my Honda Civic cutting through the darkness of the highway. Richard Coleman's story played in my mind like a slow, resonant melody, powerful, grounding. My grandfather, Edward Morgan, wasn't merely a shrewd businessman. He was a man who valued the people who helped him along the way. Gratitude, as Richard had said, wasn't empty words, it was action, a way of living. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling that small flame in my chest burning brighter, yet accompanied by a new question: where would the next letter take me? And what lesson awaited? Back at my apartment, I collapsed into a chair, exhausted, setting the wooden box on the table. The dim light illuminated its worn surface, the grain of the wood hinting at untold stories. I opened the box and drew out the 3rd letter. The red wax seal had faded, but my grandfather's sharp, commanding handwriting remained, as though daring me to defy it. "Deliver this letter to Charles Peterson, 789 Jefferson Boulevard, Detroit, Michigan." Another stranger. Another unknown address. No instructions. No explanations. Just a name and a task. The following morning, I set out on the cold, drizzly drive to Detroit. The city emerged under a gray sky, a mix of old industrial buildings and recently revitalized neighborhoods. 789 Jefferson Boulevard was a sleek, modern office building, a stark contrast to the modest homes of Springfield and Wichita. A polished sign read Peterson Properties, with smaller text beneath, Real Estate and Investment. My heart raced. Charles Peterson was no ordinary man. Who was he in my grandfather's world? I stepped into the lobby, feeling out of place amid marble floors and abstract artwork. A young receptionist looked up and smiled professionally. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "I'm here to see Mr. Charles Peterson," I replied, my voice slightly shaky. "I have a letter from Edward Morgan." Her eyes flickered at the name, then she quickly picked up the phone. Minutes later, I was escorted to the top floor, where Charles Peterson awaited. He was tall, in his 60s, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and eyes as sharp as my grandfather's. Though his suit was expensive, his smile was unexpectedly warm. Jeremy Morgan, he said, voice deep and resonant. Edward's grandson. I've heard about you. I felt awkward. Surely, he'd heard the story of the delivery boy mocked by my family. I handed him the letter, my fingers brushing the red wax seal. He took it with care, almost reverence, and read it silently. His expression shifted from curiosity to contemplation, and finally to a faint, knowing smile. He folded the letter and looked at me. Sit down, Jeremy. You need to hear this story. I sank into a leather chair in his spacious office. The sprawling Detroit skyline stretched out behind him. Charles began speaking, and I was drawn into a world I had never known. Over 30 years ago, Charles Peterson had been my grandfather's fiercest rival in the real estate industry. At the time, Morgan Enterprises was on the rise, but Peterson Properties was a giant in Detroit, with a string of high-profile projects. Edward and I were sworn enemies, Charles said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. We battled over every parcel of land, every contract, every client. I thought he was arrogant, and I'm sure he thought the same of me. In a major downtown Detroit deal, my grandfather and Charles clashed over a prime piece of property. Edward Morgan, with his razor-sharp mind and decisive nature, won. Charles didn't just lose the contract, he lost face, reputation, and leverage. I thought about revenge, Charles admitted, a cold glint in his eyes. I wanted to take him down to prove he wasn't the best. But what happened next shocked him. Instead of crushing his rival, my grandfather extended a hand. Edward proposed a partnership, inviting Charles to join a joint project, sharing profits and opportunities. I couldn't believe it, Charles said. Who partners with their rival? But your grandfather told me, today's competitor can be tomorrow's ally. Fairness and respect are the foundation of collaboration. The letter I had delivered was a copy of that first partnership agreement, signed decades ago. Attached was a note from my grandfather. Never humiliate a rival. Turn competition into shared strength. Charles looked at me, his eyes shining. Thanks to Edward, I didn't just regain my footing, I became Morgan Enterprises' biggest partner. Today, our companies still collaborate, building projects bigger than anything we ever imagined. I sat there in stunned silence. My grandfather, the man I had believed would win at all costs, understood the power of fairness and collaboration. He hadn't simply defeated a rival, he had turned him into an ally, forging a lasting relationship built on respect. And what moved me most was the warmth in Charles's voice as he spoke of my grandfather, not merely as a partner, but as a friend. I left Charles's office as the sunset painted the Detroit skyline a deep crimson. Fairness and collaboration weren't just business lessons, they were a way of life, a code for how to treat others. My grandfather had shown me this through Charles, and I began to feel that each letter was not merely a task, but a piece of the bigger picture of the person I wanted to become. Back in my Chicago apartment, I reached for the fourth letter. The wax seal had faded, but my grandfather's precise, commanding handwriting radiated authority. Deliver this letter to the Hope Haven Foundation, for 56 Lincoln Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. I froze. Chicago, less than 30 minutes from my apartment. After Ohio, Kansas, and Michigan, why bring me back here? The name Hope Haven Foundation stirred a faint memory, like a story I had heard as a child but could not fully recall. Why was it so important to him? Glancing at the clock, I realized it was nearly midnight. Part of me wanted to wait until morning, exhausted from days of driving. But a small, insistent voice urged me to go now. There was something about this letter and this place that felt different, significant in a way I didn't yet understand. I carefully placed the wooden box in my bag and stepped into the quiet Chicago night. The wind whispered past the car as streetlights cast long streaks across the windshield, guiding me toward a new chapter of the story my grandfather had begun. 456 Lincoln Avenue appeared beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. A low building sat nestled among maple trees, their leaves rustling softly. A sign read Hope Haven Foundation, with smaller text below, supporting orphaned children and struggling families. My heart quickened, not from fear, but from the strange sensation that I was about to glimpse a hidden part of my grandfather, a part my family had never mentioned. I knocked on the door, unsure if anyone would be there at this hour. After a moment, it creaked open to reveal an elderly woman with neatly tied silver hair. Her warm eyes lit up the small space instantly. "Who are you?" she asked gently, curiosity in her voice. "I'm Jeremy Morgan," I said, steadying my voice despite the unease in my chest. "I'm here to deliver this letter from my grandfather, Edward Morgan, for the Hope Haven Foundation." Her eyes widened at the name, as though a long-sealed memory had been unlocked. "Edward," she whispered. She stepped aside, inviting me in. The building was simple, cozy, and alive with warmth, the scent of freshly baked cookies in the air, distant laughter of children echoing down the hall. Drawings adorned the walls, bright colors scattered across white space like stories come to life. "I'm Margaret Hayes," she said, introducing herself as the director of the foundation. She led me to a wooden table in her small office and gestured for me to sit. I handed her the letter, my palm tightening as my fingers brushed the faded red wax seal. Margaret held it gently, her eyes tracing the handwriting as if it were sacred. A brief silence stretched between us, and I noticed a glimmer in her eyes, the hint of a deep, held-back emotion. She folded the paper and looked up, her gaze calm yet carrying a story I could sense but not yet know. "Jeremy, do you have any idea what this letter might reveal?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. I shook my head, shrinking slightly under her gaze. "No, ma'am. I was only told to deliver it." Margaret smiled softly and placed the letter next to a small framed photo on the table. "Sit down, Jeremy," she said, her tone sincere, impossible to refuse. "There's a story you need to hear, a story I believe your grandfather wanted you to understand through this task." She began to speak, each word drawing me deeper into a side of my grandfather's life I had never known. The Hope Haven Foundation was established over 40 years ago, when my grandfather was still a young entrepreneur struggling to build Morgan Enterprises. "Back then," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, "he came across a group of orphaned children living in a Chicago slum. He didn't just see hungry, neglected kids. He saw potential, dreams buried beneath poverty. Edward came to me, a young teacher then, and said, 'Margaret, we have to do something. No child should be left behind.' With the modest funds he had in those early days, my grandfather helped create the Hope Haven Foundation. But he didn't stop at money. He invested his time, building educational programs, offering scholarships, and making sure orphaned children and struggling families had a real chance to rise. He never wanted recognition," Margaret said, eyes sparkling. "He always said, doing good doesn't need a name. It just needs to be right." The letter I had delivered represented a long-term funding commitment from my grandfather, ensuring that Hope Haven would continue its work long after he was gone. Attached was a simple message: "A company is only truly strong when tied to its responsibility to the community. A great entrepreneur doesn't just create profit. He leaves a human legacy." Margaret's voice softened. "Thanks to Edward, thousands of children have had the chance to learn, to grow, to live better lives. He didn't just build a business empire, he built hope." I felt a tightening in my chest, a mixture of awe and guilt. My grandfather, the man I had believed cared only for money and power, had quietly changed thousands of lives without ever seeking credit. And yet I had never known. Growing up in the Morgan family, I had only heard stories of his intelligence, decisiveness, and business acumen. His heart, the part that quietly uplifted others, remained a mystery. "Jeremy," Margaret said, placing her hand over mine, "your grandfather chose you to deliver this letter because he believed you'd understand. Social responsibility isn't just about giving, it's how we live. How we leave our mark on the world. You carry the Morgan name, and you can carry on that legacy." I left the Hope Haven Foundation as dawn broke, sunlight spilling across Chicago's streets. Her words lingered, stirring something inside me. Social responsibility wasn't charity, it was purpose. It was creating value not just for oneself, but for the lives around you. Only one letter remained. I knew it would be the greatest challenge yet. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was Jeremy Morgan, and I was learning to live up to my grandfather's legacy, one letter at a time. Back in my apartment, I drew a deep breath and opened the lid of the wooden box. My hand closed around the fifth and final letter. The red wax seal had faded, but my grandfather's handwriting stood out, strong and familiar, like a voice calling across time. I froze at the address. Jeremy Morgan, 1423 Maple Street, Chicago, Illinois. My heart stopped. My grandfather had written this final letter to me. After all the journeys, all the stories of others, why did it circle back to the beginning? And why was I the chosen one? I held the letter, trembling, feeling the walls of my small apartment shrink around me. My grandfather's handwriting, bold and deliberate, was both a command and a promise. With careful hands I sliced the wax seal with a letter opener and unfolded the paper. His strong, precise script seemed to cut through the air, as if he were standing there in the room, looking straight into me. Jeremy, my grandson, if you are reading this, it means you have met Marco, Richard, Charles, and Hope Haven, the people I chose to teach you about trust, gratitude, fairness, and social responsibility. But this letter is for no one else. It is for you. Because you are the only one I trust to carry my legacy forward. Once your family doubted you. They saw you as unworthy of the Morgan name. But I saw a spark in you, an intellect and a heart they never recognized. I am not leaving you property or money, those things can vanish. I am leaving you lessons, so that you may forge your own path. In this box, you will find a document, a portfolio I prepared long ago. It is not a gift to squander, but a tool to create value, to build something that lasts. But remember, Jeremy, wealth is not the destination, it is the means. If you have absorbed the lessons of trust, gratitude, fairness, and social responsibility, you will know how to use it. If not, it will become a burden. Do not let doubt or the ridicule of others define you. You are Jeremy Morgan, and you have the potential to surpass everything I have ever achieved. Live in a way worthy of yourself. Edward Morgan. I folded the letter, a surge of emotion rising inside me like waves crashing against the shore. My eyes stung, not from the humiliation I had felt the day the will was read, but from a deep sense of gratitude and pride. My grandfather had truly seen me, even when the rest of the family saw only failure. I opened the wooden box and, just as he had described, beneath the lining lay a thin document detailing a portfolio of stocks, small real estate holdings, and an investment fund designed for long-term growth. It wasn't the millions my parents or James had inherited, but it was a beginning, a chance my grandfather believed I could turn into something greater. I sank into the chair, clutching the letter, feeling my heartbeat stronger than ever. For the first time, I didn't feel like the family's laughingstock. My grandfather hadn't left me an empty box. He had left me a challenge, a roadmap to discovering my true self. Most importantly, he had left me faith that I could grow into a man worthy of the Morgan name. In the weeks that followed, I studied the portfolio. It was modest yet structured with the intelligence and vision only my grandfather could have conceived. I made the decision to leave my job at the finance company. Despite my boss's skeptical looks and the whispers of colleagues, I knew I no longer belonged there. With the capital from the portfolio, I founded Morgan Ventures, a small real estate company dedicated to supporting people like Marco, those with talent and passion but no opportunity. I carried the 4 lessons with me: trust and talent, gratitude for those who help, fair competition, and responsibility to the community. The early years were grueling. I faced failures, doubt, and occasional sneers from my family. Yet whenever I felt like giving up, I would open the 5th letter and read my grandfather's words again. They were like wind in the sails, reigniting my determination. I wasn't just a delivery boy anymore. I was Jeremy Morgan, and I could do more. 9 years have passed. Morgan Ventures has grown into more than a business. It is a close-knit team, a collection of projects creating real value for the community, and a company known for integrity. Meanwhile, news of my family trickled in. My father, my mother, James, and the relatives who once mocked me had squandered their inheritance through poor investments and mismanagement. Morgan Enterprises, my grandfather's empire, was crumbling under their control. In those early years, I rarely had time to think of them. Every day demanded my attention, from securing partners and convincing investors to ensuring that each real estate project created tangible impact. Yet in my heart, I always carried the 5 letters like torches lighting my path: trust from Marco, gratitude from Richard, fairness from Charles, social responsibility from Hope Haven, and above all, belief in myself from the 5th letter. These weren't just lessons, they were principles guiding every decision I made. I didn't build Morgan Ventures to prove anything to my family. I built it to honor my grandfather's legacy. Yet life, like a river, carries unexpected news. Slowly, I learned of my family's failures. My father, Robert Morgan, once the heir apparent, sold the Lake Forest mansion, the centerpiece of the will, to fund a risky Miami project. It failed, costing millions and damaging his reputation. Aunt Ellen sold her Florida and California properties to invest in a tech startup, which went bankrupt within 2 years. James, my arrogant cousin who had mocked me as a delivery boy, wasted his $2 million inheritance on luxury cars, vacations, and ill-advised investments. Morgan Enterprises faltered. My father, as chairman, could not manage the constant disputes among shareholders, mostly our relatives. They fought over personal gain, made impulsive decisions, and allowed incompetent managers to run the company. Projects stalled, clients were lost, and the once proud symbol of my grandfather's vision crumbled. I read an article in the Chicago Tribune: Morgan Enterprises crumbles under poor management. It named my father, but not me. Oddly, that brought a sense of relief. I didn't want any part of that failure. Meanwhile, Morgan Ventures followed a different path. I started small, building modest real estate projects aimed at creating opportunity for people like Marco. I hired not for prestige, but for passion and integrity. I remembered Richard Coleman's words: no one succeeds alone. I made sure every team member, from engineers to administrative staff, felt valued, expressing gratitude at every opportunity. I learned from Charles Peterson how to turn competitors into partners, forging alliances with small but promising companies. From Hope Haven, I understood that a business is more than profit, it must create value for the community. Morgan Ventures funded local schools, built parks, and supported programs for underprivileged children, things I knew my grandfather would have been proud of. But success didn't come easily. There were sleepless nights fretting over bank loans, contracts that could collapse at any moment, and skeptical stares from investors. There were days I questioned whether I was on the right path, whether I was truly worthy of my grandfather's trust. In those moments, I opened the wooden box and reread the 5th letter. My grandfather's words were like a gust of wind, reigniting my resolve: don't let doubt or the mockery of others define you. Step by step, I pressed on, building Morgan Ventures into a company that was not only profitable but meaningful. Meanwhile, my family sank further into ruin. James, my cousin who had once flaunted yachts and lavish parties on Instagram, was rumored to be drowning in debt. Aunt Ellen, who had mocked me during the will reading, was forced to sell her Chicago home to pay off creditors. My mother, always impeccably put together, had all but vanished from public life, avoiding the whispers and stares. And my father, once the epitome of confidence, now moved quietly, his eyes heavy with fatigue and disappointment. One autumn afternoon, I received a call from him. His voice on the phone was frail, lacking the authority it once carried. "Jeremy," he said, "we need to talk about Morgan Enterprises." I stood by the window of Morgan Ventures' small office, gazing down at the Chicago streets bathed in the golden glow of sunset. My father's call felt like a stone dropped into the calm waters of my heart, rippling through me. Over the past 9 years, I had built Morgan Ventures from nothing into a respected real estate company, with projects that added real value to the community, and a team that had become like family. I had learned from my grandfather's 5 letters: trust, gratitude, fairness, responsibility, and belief in myself, and had grown into a leader I once thought impossible. Yet now my family, the ones who had mocked me at the will reading, were coming to me for help. Morgan Enterprises, the empire my grandfather had spent a lifetime building, teetered on the brink of collapse. And I, the boy they once called a delivery boy, was the one they now had to face. I agreed to meet my father at the old Morgan Enterprises office, not to gloat, but because a part of me still felt a duty to honor my grandfather's legacy. Stepping into the building, memories from 9 years ago surged back. The polished wood-paneled walls, the sharp glances, James's mocking laughter as I received the wooden box with 5 letters. But now the space was different. Dust lay across the floor. Paintings had dulled with age, and the air felt heavy with failure. My father sat at the head of the conference table, his hair now completely white, his face etched with the passage of time. James slouched in a corner, his eyes cast downward, stripped of the arrogance he had once carried. Aunt Ellen and a few other relatives lingered, but none dared meet my gaze. My mother was absent. I had heard she had quietly left Chicago, retreating to a small town to escape the whispers about our family's decline. "Jeremy," my father began, his voice trembling, each word sounding as if it were torn from a shattered sense of pride. "The company is in trouble. We've lost major contracts. Investors are pulling out. We need you." His eyes met mine. Not the authoritative gaze of a father, but the pleading look of a man begging for help. A wave of conflicting emotions rose within me: pity, anger, sadness. This was the family that had once humiliated me, that had considered me worthless. And now they were looking to me, the one they had scorned, for salvation. I remained silent, letting the tension stretch. James shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenched tightly, as if restraining something. And Ellen, once so quick with a cruel, condescending smile, now fiddled nervously with a ring, her gaze fixed on the floor. I wasn't here for revenge. I wasn't here to boast about Morgan Ventures. I was here to decide how I would honor my grandfather, and whether I would allow the past to define the future. I came because I carried the Morgan name, and because I wanted to protect my grandfather's legacy, not by crushing my family, but by doing what was right. "Dad," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I built Morgan Ventures on the lessons my grandfather left me. I didn't just make money, I built a team, created value for the community, and upheld integrity. Morgan Enterprises can be saved, but not by continuing the way you've been running it." James finally spoke, his voice sharp but betraying unease. "You think you're better than us, don't you? You were just a kid with a wooden box, Jeremy. And now you're going to lecture us?" His words were like knives, but they no longer cut me as they had 9 years ago. I met his gaze steadily. "I'm not lecturing anyone, James," I replied. "I learned from my grandfather that a company isn't just about money or power. It's about trust, gratitude, fairness, and responsibility. You all had everything: properties, shares, millions of dollars, but you let it slip away. I had nothing but 5 letters, and now I stand here with a thriving company while Morgan Enterprises is crumbling." The room went silent. James lowered his eyes, saying nothing more. My father stared at me, a mixture of pain and surprise in his gaze, as if he were seeing a son he had never truly known. I pulled a document from my briefcase, a restructuring plan I had prepared for Morgan Enterprises. It wasn't a hostile takeover, but a proposal for collaboration. I suggested merging parts of Morgan Enterprises with Morgan Ventures, having my team manage the remaining projects while instilling the values I had learned, partnering with small but promising companies, investing in the community, and rebuilding trust with clients. "This isn't about me taking control," I said, sliding the plan toward my father. "It's about saving my grandfather's legacy. But you have to change. No more fighting for personal gain. No more reckless decisions. If you agree, Morgan Ventures will help. If not, I won't waste my time." My father took the plan, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, but also shame. He knew that I, the son he had once doubted, was now the only one who could save what was left of Morgan Enterprises. Aunt Ellen spoke, her voice soft and stripped of its former arrogance. "Jeremy, we were wrong to judge you. Will you do this for the family?" I looked at her, recalling her mocking smile from the will reading. But I felt no anger, only clarity. "I'm doing this for my grandfather," I said, "and for what he taught me. But if the family wants to be part of it, you have to prove you're worthy." The meeting ended with a heavy but meaningful silence. My father agreed to the plan, though I knew it wounded his pride deeply. James said nothing, but the look in his eyes as he left was a reluctant acknowledgement that I had surpassed him. I stepped out of the Morgan Enterprises building. The autumn wind of Chicago swirled around me, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves. I paused, looking up at the structure that had once symbolized my grandfather's empire. Now it was a faded shadow, its dusty windows reflecting the weak light of sunset. 9 years ago, I had left this room humiliated, clutching the wooden box as if it were the final insult. Today, I stood here not as a failure, but as a man who had found his path, guided by my grandfather's 5 letters. I drove back to Morgan Ventures, my heart heavy yet calm. The office welcomed me with its familiar warmth. My employees, my real family, bustled with work. One team discussed a low-cost housing project in the suburbs, while another prepared documents for a scholarship program supporting underprivileged children. They looked up as I entered, smiling. No tension, no rivalry. Here, we worked toward a shared purpose guided by my grandfather's values. I gathered everyone and shared the plan to collaborate with Morgan Enterprises. "We're not just saving a company," I said firmly. "We're preserving a legacy. One of trust, integrity, and responsibility." They nodded, their eyes bright with agreement, and I knew I had built a team that worked not just for profit, but for something greater. In the months that followed, we dove into restructuring Morgan Enterprises. We integrated the Morgan Ventures team, applying the strategies that had made us successful, partnering with small but promising companies, investing in community projects, and rebuilding trust with clients. I worked closely with my father, though it wasn't always easy. He kept his usual tough exterior, but I noticed a subtle shift in his eyes. Not submission, but a reluctant respect. He began to listen, to ask questions, and on rare occasions even smiled when I shared stories of the community projects Morgan Ventures had undertaken. James, after the meeting, almost vanished. I heard he had left Chicago, carrying his debts and whatever pride remained. Aunt Ellen reached out once, sending a brief email. "Jeremy, you've done what we couldn't." "Thank you." I read it silently, but never replied. Morgan Enterprises slowly came back to life, not as the flashy empire of old, but as a sustainable company tied to the community. One of the first projects I launched was a low-cost housing complex, inspired by the Hope Haven Foundation, to help struggling families in Chicago. When the project was completed, I invited Margaret Hayes to the opening ceremony. She stood beside me, watching children laugh and play in the new playground, families beaming as they received their keys. She took my hand, her voice trembling with emotion. "Edward would be so proud of you, Jeremy," she said. "You haven't just carried on his legacy, you've made it shine even brighter." Her words sent a wave of warmth through me, as if my grandfather were somewhere nearby, observing with that same sharp but satisfied gaze. One morning, while reviewing Morgan Ventures' financial reports, a handwritten letter arrived at the office. There was no sender listed, only the familiar red wax seal. I opened it, and my father's trembling handwriting appeared. "Dear Jeremy, my son. I was wrong not to believe in you. I let pride blind me, and I lost what your grandfather built. But you've done what I could not. I'm proud of you, even if these words come too late. Thank you for saving Morgan Enterprises, and thank you for being a better man than I was. Robert Morgan." I folded the letter, a quiet calm spreading through me. His apology was unexpected, but it closed old wounds. I placed it in the wooden box beside my grandfather's 5 letters, the artifacts of a journey from humiliation to growth, from doubt to understanding. My family, my father, James, Aunt Ellen, had everything, yet chose to squander and fight. I, with only 5 letters, had chosen a different path. One guided by trust, gratitude, fairness, responsibility, and belief in myself. The wooden box on my shelf was no longer a mockery. It had become a treasure, a reminder that true legacy isn't measured in wealth or status, but in the lessons that shape who we are. I am Jeremy Morgan, and I have lived worthily, not by defeating anyone, but by living true to a purpose. Trust, gratitude, fairness, responsibility.